I mean, some people feel very comfortable and calculated in just following the norm, getting a job, and going after that, which we both have as well.
Yes.
But doing something on your own and putting yourself out there, we are taking a risk at being criticized.
Yes.
Right? We're taking a risk at getting very successful and maybe not being able to handle it quickly.
Yes.
It's a lot of risk going into this, but it's worth it. If anything, you're going to take a risk on something or someone, yourself should be at the top of that list.
Absolutely.
Happy New Year! Welcome to 2025 and our 26th episode of Love, Growth, and Narratives. I'm Tiffany.
And I'm Frederick.
We are so glad to be here once again, starting the new year afresh. Does that make sense? Afresh?
Yeah, I think that we'll work with that.
Okay, we'll work with that. We're excited to be here once again and to bring some content to you and get some feedback from you. Today, we're going to be talking about taking risks and taking risks or not taking risks and the impact that has on our lives. And our risks are different depending on our situation and also our appetite for taking risks. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah, it's just, we've taken a lot of risks throughout this year, throughout this relationship. And we wanted to look at how, the risks that we've taken, even the ones that didn't always pan out, how you've learned a lesson from it, but how you really don't get much when you don't take risks. You don't really learn much.
You don't. You stay kind of in the same place. And
yes.
Life starts happening to you instead of you creating the life that you want.
Yes.
We didn't quite reach our goal of 100 subscribers on YouTube, but we are not giving up. We're still going towards it. We are closer to it than we are from it. I like to think of it in those terms. So please continue to share this podcast and to subscribe. I know there's a lot of people who listen, but maybe you don't subscribe, but hitting that subscribe button really does help us. So we appreciate you taking the time out to do that.
Yeah, and we want to make sure that you actually do listen when you do subscribe. We don't want people subscribing and not listening,
right?
Because the algorithm doesn't like that. So
exactly.
But for those of you who are listeners, we really would appreciate for you to subscribe and, like and share and give a little comment as well. That always works out well.
Yes.
So I guess we're going to get started with the episode 2026. Nope, 2025. I'm about to screw that up. It's gonna take me about a month to get the whole year thing correct. So Bear with me here, but we'll go ahead and get started with the episode.
Awesome.
All right, so here we are, back episode 26.
Yes.
The reason why I really wanted this topic of managing risks and taking risks and things of that nature was because that's how we got this podcast started. This is something we had talked about for a couple of years, and you end up getting into your own head, at least I did, before we started. It was like, there's a million podcasts out there. Why would anybody care about what we have to say? We have to start buying equipment and putting time together to do this, and then I was at the gym, my gym, Strong House Fitness, over there in Los Angeles. And a good friend of mine, Shug, who has a successful podcast called Score of Society. Everybody should check that out. My man, Sean Amos. And he was telling me that, you really don't know what you're doing, but you just try it and learn as you go. And he really inspired me because his first podcast, the audio kind of fell apart. It was a bit of a mess. And I was wondering if he was actually going to put it out there. And he did. And he said, well, this is what we have to go through to grow. And I don't want to hide that from people because I want people to know that these things, it doesn't always work out the way you want to. But now he's got this thriving podcast and he's built a brand and everything. But in the beginning, didn't know what he was doing. And so he was kind of a mentor for me to kind of get the process going and to just jump out and start. And when we first started, we were audio. We had, bought some, wireless microphones and still trying to figure out what we were doing. We had a lot of ums and ands, a whole lot of fillers and a lot of issues. But look at how we've grown from it. We still have a lot to figure out. But if you look at our growth in just the course of the past 25 episodes, it's been humongous. But had we not taken the risk, had we not said, hey, we do have something to talk about that's important, then where would we be?
Exactly. I mean, I think starting a business is always risky.
Yes.
But it's also risky not to bet on yourself.
Yes.
I mean, some people feel very comfortable and calculated in just following the norm, getting a job and going after that, which we both have as well.
Yes.
But doing something on your own and putting yourself out there, we are taking a risk at being criticized.
Yes.
Right? We're taking a risk at getting very successful and maybe not being able to handle it quickly.
Yes.
It's a lot of risk going into this, but it's worth it. If anything, you're going to take a risk on something or someone, yourself should be at the top of that list.
Absolutely. And it kind of goes back into my days when I was in government and I was a hiring manager. One of the favorite questions I would ask people is, if you look throughout your career and through your life, what do you most regret? The things you did or the things you didn't do? And that question really reveals a lot about a person, because if a person regrets more the things that they've done, then their appetite for risk is really low. And more often than not, they may not take chances and may be afraid of failure. But for those people like myself, I regret the shots that I didn't take. I regret the things that I didn't try. I don't regret the things that I've done, even the times where I totally screwed it up and embarrassed myself. I learned from them. And I also felt the confidence that I can go out there and try things. And so it's important, because you see so many people go through their life and they're too safe. And it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with safety. I'm definitely not saying that.
Right.
Because we all have things at stake. But within what you can do, what is a safe risk, what is a calculated risk, where you can actually learn something and grow and get more confident in yourself, you really do owe it to yourself to try it.
You do. And here's a risk that we took on our honeymoon recently to Belize. Both of us not being swimmers. I mean, there was a time where I could swim. It's not one of those things, in my experience, that you just always know how to do.
Yeah.
If you get out of shape, you kind of start over a little bit. But we snorkeled, right? And we went pretty far out there.
Yes.
And of course we had on the life jacket, was wrapped around our waist, and we had a professional person with us to, who really just stayed by our side. But still, the fact that we did that, we were out there a good 45 minutes an hour.
Yes.
That was a risk. But what we got to see and experience was so worth it. I'm not saying, again, that was a calculated risk, right? I'm not going to go out there without any, anything to help me. But, the fact that we did that, I think, speaks volumes, and I think more people should take some risks so that they can see and experience different things, of course, within reason.
Yeah, and look at what we got from it. We got the experience. I'd never snorkeled before. Of course, I'm not a swimmer. I was scared out of my mind initially, but once I got in there and realized that the life vest was going to keep me afloat, and I start looking down into the water, it made the risk worth it.
Right.
It really did. You look at also, last year our son went to Europe for 16 days. There was a risk of sending him on that trip.
Right.
You're sending a 16-year-old child off to, a bunch of different countries, and they don't have you to fall back on if something goes wrong.
Right.
You have to hope. But the reason why we took that risk is because it's a growth opportunity for him.
And I'm so glad that we took it, because I see a huge spurt of growth in him. And I think he sees it himself. Like, just, it really made a huge difference. You wouldn't think it would make such a difference, one experience, but It really does, especially it's so different from what he's used to and experiencing and everything. And him knowing that we were taking a chance on him and
Yes.
believing in him and trusting him to go out there and make good choices, but to also
Yeah.
experience something he had never experienced before. And it is scary, right? Getting
It
the phone
is.
calls at the different hours of the night about this, that, and the other, getting lost and whatever.
Oh boy.
But it was worth it. It really
Yes.
was.
Yeah, and even though the first couple of days of that, it was really a tough risk to take because, of course, he, ended up misplacing his cell phone for a while there, misplacing his passport, and we're like, oh my goodness,
Lost his keys.
oh boy, it's like what are we doing? However, because he had to figure things out on his own,
Right.
and he realized that he could figure things out on his own, the growth has been more than we could have imagined.
Right. And I think other risks that I personally feel like I've taken is getting into this marriage, right?
Yeah.
Like it's a risk for everyone,
Yes.
Some people would say, well, I'm much older, getting into this, someone who has a son, a fairly young son, right? Like
Mhm.
someone who still, needs to be cared for by parents. And that was a risk, jumping into that. But the benefits have been amazing. I mean, of course, it's calculated. I wasn't like just, I can see that this is a great guy. You know what I mean? But it still is a risk, especially when I'm used to being single and I know exactly what to expect.
Yes.
And, I know what I'm capable of and not capable of and everything else. And you throw somebody else in the mix and you kind of have to put your life in their hands,
Yes.
so to speak. So, these risks are definitely worth it.
Yeah, and that was a large risk for you, not just because of me, but then our son, and then a dog,
Mhm.
a crazy dog who
Right.
needs attention and constant petting.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
So yes, that was a risk. What about in your career? Do you feel like you've taken risks?
Well, I think just in the way that I approach teaching and approach being what I consider kind of a coach
Hmm.
as my for my students and my parents, just doing things a little bit off the cuff, not being afraid to try something new, not being
Yeah.
afraid to take out something that's not working, not being afraid to completely revamp myself and my thinking in order to see progress, in order to actually to put faith in something that I can't see yet, which is
Yes.
really hard, which is I think a lot of teachers are doing, right? Like we see those numbers, we see the data, but sometimes that doesn't reflect what the student is really capable of doing.
Yeah.
And you worry, you feel like I have these 9 months and I have to do all of this in this 9 months and I better follow everything to a T. Otherwise I'm going to mess things up. But that's not true, and you're investing in that child, things that may not come out until later. And you have to take the risks that's important to do that. And I think I've had enough times where students and families have come back to me
Yes,
and
you
told
have.
me years, decades, even later, what the risk that I took. I can't even believe I took some of those risks back then. I'm like, what? That was me. But it was worth it. It definitely was worth it. And just to learn something new and to do something different and to stand out from the crowd and to question things and all of that. Although I'm getting a little bit tired of that, so I'm ready to take a new risk on myself
Yes.
and put that energy towards myself, because it does get kind of exhausting when you're trying to take risks and other people don't want to take those risks, or they're
Yes.
trying to stop you from taking those risks.
Yeah.
So you just have to find a different way to do what it is you want to do. And it's another risk. It's another
Yeah.
calculated risk to go a different route.
Yeah.
What about you taking the risk of moving all the way out here away from everyone?
It wasn't just the risk of moving out here. It was the risk of leaving the government,
Mm,
because at the time I was a GS-15. I was in a comfortable position, and a lot of people were telling me, "Okay, you're good. Just ride this out to retirement."
mhm,
The problem is that I felt uninspired. I felt bored. I felt like I wasn't growing,
mhm.
and so at the time, I figured that I would stay in the government as long as there was a job that I was working towards that I wanted. But then I got to a point where I looked around, especially at my agency, and I said, There's nothing that excites me. So it's time to go." And I saw how many people, because they were afraid of risk, stayed in jobs that they really didn't like, that didn't inspire them, just so that they could retire. And I'm not saying that that's the worst thing in the world, but the problem is then you look back and it's like, what have you actually accomplished?
Mm-hmm.
And now you've also taught your children and whoever else is around you that, you just suffer through things that aren't good for you, so that you can hopefully sometime 30, 40 years down the road have a retirement check.
Right.
And for me, I didn't want that. And then, when what happened with a friend of mine I told you about who committed suicide in 2017, I just said, you know what? I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this. But one of the things was also, I watched a lot of or listened to a lot of Tim Ferriss's podcast, which I still do.
Mm-hmm.
But one of them that he talked about that was really critical for me when he was talking about fear setting, and basically going through in your mind and saying, what's the worst that can happen? And then how would you respond to the absolute worst case scenario?
Mm-hmm.
And as you go through and you realize that you can survive the worst case scenario, it may hurt you a bit. You may be embarrassed, the whole 9 yards, but you'll be okay. And then what's the chances that the worst case scenario are going to happen?
Right.
And so I said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and do it. And people thought I was crazy. And, the first year out here was pretty tough. First
Mm-hmm.
couple of years out here was pretty tough.
Mm-hmm.
But now that I'm in this relationship and I'm here doing this podcast with a woman that I love, it makes it just makes it all make sense.
Right. And I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that when we take risks, we do fail sometimes.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Oh,
and just like you said, knowing that we can get past that,
yes.
feeling that too will come to pass if we're doing the right thinking, the right
Yes.
type of, self-talk and things like that, but that it's part of the journey.
Yes.
Because as you take those risks and you may be failing or things may not be
Mhm.
going the way you want to, it makes you pivot and do different things. And so your outcome, could be better than it was what you planned because of those
Absolutely.
mistakes and those faults that came along the way.
But a lot of what's required in that is looking at yourself. When I was a GS-14 when I first got into government, I wanted to make it to the GS-15 level.
Mm-hmm.
And I was acting in a GS-15 position, and that job opened up, and everybody thought it was mine. It was just, it was a foregone conclusion
Mm-hmm.
that I was going to get the job, and I didn't.
Mm.
And it was so embarrassing. But what I did was I went to everyone on the interview panel and just asked them what happened. And the responses that they gave me helped me to understand that I didn't deserve that job.
Mm.
That I got a bit arrogant.
Mm.
And I phoned in the interview. I mean, I went into the interview, I had my chest puffed out, and I didn't take the time to take the interview seriously, to sell myself, to let them know that I deserve to be in that position.
Okay.
And that was really hurtful for me.
Mm-hmm.
But I had to realize, well, that was my screw up, which in a lot of ways is good, because if it's my screw up, that means I can fix it.
Mm-hmm.
If it's someone else's screw up, I can't fix other people.
Right.
But at least if it's my screw up, I can fix it. And I went through the interview process again 3 more times and kept coming up short. And then, the people around me are looking at me like, why do you keep trying? You're a 14. Just stay like this. You can retire like this. What is the problem? Why do you keep trying?
Mm-hmm.
I said, because I have to do better. But each one of those interviews, I went around to figure out, hey, where did I go wrong? Where did I screw up? And then I started learning. And so by the time I got to that last position that I was going for, because I had failed so many times and had learned so much,
Mm-hmm.
I just had this next one down, and I just nailed it. but I would not have nailed it had I not learned from those other failures.
Right. Right.
And so if you look at how failures can build you, as long as you put it on yourself and don't go around blaming the world, you can really use failure as a launching pad for yourself.
Yeah. So what you're saying is you kept going regardless of the failure. You
Yes.
kept taking the risk over and over. So what we need to keep in mind is that when we're risk taking, and we need to be consistent in that risk taking,
Yes.
learning along the way. I mean, the risk taking of like you said, this podcast, right?
Yes.
There are days, when Sunday comes around, which is usually when we record, I'm like, I do not feel like it. Like, I don't feel the greatest today, right? I'm
Mhm.
getting over the flu. I can still
Yes.
hear it in my voice. I'm cloudy a little bit. And there's just days where I'm like, I don't know what we're going to talk about. Should we do this? We've been going at it for 6 months now. And, it took us, 3 months to get 5 more subscribers.
Right.
But when I listen to other people's stories who
Yes.
have taken risks, and I listen to what they went through and how many times they were either shut out, told no, whatever the
Yes.
case may be,
Yes.
and they made it.
Yes.
That's how I know I need to keep going. Even when I don't feel like it,
Yeah.
I need to keep going, because that feeling is going to pass too,
Oh,
of
absolutely.
not feeling like it. Like, I'm going to
Yes.
feel better, next Sunday or whatever. So I have
Yes.
to keep moving through it. And so that's what we have to remember to do when we're taking risks, to keep moving through it, even when it doesn't seem like it's working in our favor,
Yeah.
and taking the little lessons along the way.
Yeah. And you really have to love the journey. Unfortunately, people fall in love with the destination. They see someone who's made it
Right.
and they're like, wow, I wish I could be them, and
Mhm.
I become jealous of them. But you don't see what led to that. All the hard work, all the embarrassment, all the screw ups,
Mhm.
all the late nights that led to that. So you really have to fall in love with the journey, and I enjoy this journey. We've had podcasts where we weren't really sure what we were doing,
Mhm.
and I mean, the first time we did video, we really didn't know what we were doing. But it's just you realize that you're gonna get better,
Mhm.
and you have that confidence in yourself that I can get better.
Mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of it is just not worrying about also what other people think as
Yeah.
they watch
Yeah.
you fall, and
Yeah.
yourself, and as you watch yourself fall. It's hard to do, right? Because we're living in a society now where we're watching people. We can watch people what feels like 24/7,
Yes.
and we see this certain way that they present themselves, but we don't see all those little failures. And that's what I tried to do when I was at the height of my fitness journey.
Hmm.
I tried to be really transparent about the times that I would fall, the things that I would eat, the mistakes I would make, the tough times.
Hmm.
And I feel like people really appreciated that. And I as well like to, when I'm following someone that I admire, I want to see people who are going to show and tell the real story,
Yeah.
the hard times. And I try to tell that same thing to my students when we're studying
Hmm.
someone that we consider to be great in history. Let's talk about all the mistakes they made and all the
Yes.
failures and the risks they were taking,
Yes.
and how, because even though they did some of these really great things, some other things fell by the wayside.
Right.
And that's a risk that you have to take as well.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really important, to not just shine on the brightest parts. You have to be able to see the dark areas too, so that people can see, like, I can get through this, and that it's something that you can work through,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. I was actually reading something the other day about Apple becoming a $4 trillion company,
Wow.
and everybody is now talking about that, but no one talks about all the failed products that they came out with,
Hmm.
all the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars they spent on initiatives that didn't go well.
Yeah.
You remember the times that they had a hit,
Hmm.
and so it's one of those things where you realize that this is just part of the journey. It's just, I can't imagine people who are like actors, especially when they get started, because they hear no a whole lot more times than yes.
Right.
Same thing with people in sales.
Yeah.
People
Yeah.
in sales are the same way. It's like
Mhm.
you're constantly hearing no,
Yeah.
and you have to get to a point where you're unaffected by it,
Mhm.
and you just keep pressing.
Yeah.
But what else is there? My fear from the beginning of my career, even when I was in my 20s, my fear was looking back and not having anything to smile about.
Mhm.
That was my fear. And so I've taken a lot of risks. Some of them probably weren't the smartest risks to
Mhm.
take.
Mhm.
I'm not going to act like all of my risks were great, but
Right.
but but realizing that there's no other way for me to feel fulfilled in life than to put myself out there and see what happens. So I got a question for you.
Mhm.
You've been teaching for a lot of years, and how does it work with you in terms of taking risks with students? And the reason why I ask that is because as a teacher, the outcome of your risk taking may not be known for a decade.
Mhm.
Sometimes you may never know,
Right.
if the risk that you took with a child panned out or not. How does that work?
I I don't know. Honestly, I don't have a way to. I mean, because I've stayed in the same place for a long time,
Yeah.
people know where to find me, so I've been able to get some feedback over the years, which
Right.
is great. But I just kind of base it off of, you know, just staying up to date with things that are going on in the
Mm-hmm.
world, basically talking to kids, really. They'll give you a lot about what works and what doesn't work with them,
Yeah.
because we, the adults and the educators, we have our own ideas and mindset about, right? And then you got people who have PhDs and they study this, that, and the other for however long. But honestly, the people right in front of you are the ones who are going to give you the best feedback about what you're doing. And so have been finding myself having to pivot. I mean, I've been teaching for a very long time. This is my 30th year, but yet it's never the same. It's always different. Even though you have similar personalities, with technology and
Mm-hmm.
the way social society is right now, there are some really big differences that we're up against, and you have to use some of that
Yeah.
to get to the people. And so some people feel like that's risky. I got to do what I've always done. I have to do what the books tells me to do. I
Yeah.
have to do what whoever has whatever letters behind their name tells me to do. You have to take a risk and sometimes just do based on what you know, and take in what you've read and what you've learned from other people and what you're seeing before you, and apply that to what you're doing.
Yeah.
So you just have to try out different things.
Yeah.
There's no, I wish there was this one way. I mean, people will try to tell you there's this one way. If you just do this,
Yeah.
if you just do that, right? But we all
Yeah.
know we didn't do what we're doing now. And yet we learned to read,
Yes.
write, and do everything. So there isn't just one way. And you have to trust that. You have to trust that you also know some things,
Yes.
right? You don't have to look outward all the time. And so that's not comfortable for everybody, because some people are, I have to do exactly what someone's telling me to do.
Mm-hmm.
And otherwise, I'm afraid that my ideas don't matter, they don't work, I don't want to speak up. But you want your students to take a risk every time they open their mouths, right? Because
Right.
they're learning. So
Yes.
you're asking them to take these risks and answer questions and maybe be wrong and try out things and all of that and make mistakes. So you have to do that as well as an educator. Otherwise, I think you kind of failed if you're not willing to take risks along with your students.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you said was important when you talked about pivoting, because when you take a risk, you are working off of incomplete information.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have the perfect knowledge of the risk that you're taking, but you realize that it's something that needs to be done. And then what you do is, as you're taking that risk, you're making assessments and you're saying, okay, well, this piece of what I'm doing, I need to change that. And
Mm-hmm.
you kind of learn as you go along. And I think that's what a lot of people are afraid of in terms of taking risks, is because they don't know all of what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But that's part of that's the learning pieces.
Right. Right.
You absolutely don't, when we started this podcast, we didn't know what we were doing.
Right.
We had no idea. Not that we're authorities on it now, but
No.
we still have a lot of learning.
Mm-hmm.
But look at how much we've learned just in these past 6 months or so by taking the risk.
Right. And I think looking towards people who have taken the risks that you want to take is really big too. You know, you can observe. You don't have to do exactly what they did, but I think it helps a lot. It's like studying someone and how they did things, and I think that really that helps me refine myself, at least as an educator.
Yeah.
You know, especially some of the younger, that I don't want to say younger per se, but some of the newer teachers, right? Because they're learning different things that we didn't learn in our educational program.
Right.
And so I've learned from them, and I can take what I know and what they know and run with it and take that risk, you know, and I think it's okay to do that. And people have to feel comfortable, you know, just taking a few more risks. I know that I would say I pretty much was a safe person most of my life. I mean, some people would say I've taken risks, right? It just depends on where you're standing.
Right.
But I think I'm more calculated, but I'm trying to, in 2025, I want to be more free and more vulnerable with myself, and taking risks that aren't necessarily, I'm not talking about huge like financial career, but just putting myself out there or putting myself first. That feels risky to me because I'm not used to doing that. And I'm worried about how I'm going to be perceived. But I feel like that's where I am at this point in my life. Like, it is time to start investing in myself.
Yes.
And not feeling guilty about it. It feels risky though. It does, because when you do that, sometimes you lose people.
Yeah.
You know, along the way, but you can also gain people. So it's just, it's not about being cruel or mean, but it is a risk that I feel like I'm really ready to take as I'm entering the later part of my life. There's some things I need to bet on me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, in these last few minutes, I wanted to talk about one might be a little bit more controversial risk. Is, I've talked about before being a gun owner and having a concealed carry permit. And so I carry a gun every day when I leave the house. And I have people who say, well, that's risky to carry a gun every day. And for me, I feel like it's risky for me not to. Um, and people will, quickly say, 'cause I get into a lot of discussions with friends and family about this who disagree with that. And they say, well, what are the odds that when you leave the house that something's going to happen? And I ask them, don't just think about the odds, think about the stakes. What's at stake if I leave out here and I do end up in a situation where I'm being robbed or attacked or whatever the case may be? What's at stake is my life. And so for me, the stakes are high. And for me, the risk of carrying a gun is much lower because I train, because I'm comfortable with it. And I also know that I don't want to have to ever use it.
Right.
And so that's the important part. But there again, there's always risk. And so I try not to be too judgmental when people say, well, it's not worth the risk for them. And that's totally fine. This is all based on everyone's risk appetite. Everyone's appetite for risk is going to be different.
Right.
That's just the way it is. And I'm not saying that they're wrong for taking the risk, in my opinion, for taking the risk of not protecting yourself or of not having a way to protect yourself when it comes down to it. But they look at me as taking a risk, and that's fine.
Right.
But either way, you want to take the risk where where success works in your favor, where success helps you in some way or saves you in some way. The difficulty is, I have difficulty a lot of times with people who don't take risks at all, because I don't see how you grow if you don't ever take any risk.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, with that said, I want to ask you out there, what risks will you be taking in 2025? What risks have you taken that have either taught you a huge lesson or have moved you closer to your goals or maybe made you pivot completely different direction? Share that with us. And we are looking forward to hearing back from you.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear the stories of when risks didn't went sideways. It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
and we both have plenty of those types of stories. But yeah, it's really critical that, especially this year, that we really try to grow.
Yep.
And try to get better.
Absolutely. It's about growth every day.
So for this 26th episode of Love, Growth, and Narratives in 2025, I'm going to get the year correct.
Yeah.
That's important. I may screw it up tomorrow, but I'm going to get it right today. It's 2025. But I'm Frederick.
And I'm Tiffany.
Thank you so much. And we appreciate you, and we will see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.